Okay, we're ready to start. Welcome to a special candidate conversation event presented by the League of Women Voters of Nebraska. I'm Diane Bystrom, Director of Communication for the League of Women Voters, and I'll be the facilitator for tonight's conversation. The League of Women Voters is a nonpartisan organization and does not endorse political candidates or parties. Our purpose is to empower voters and defend democracy by focusing on policy issues. As a result of our discussions, we hope voters who see this broadcast will be ready to make an informed decision during election time. Tonight is the second of two sessions to hear from candidates for the state legislature running in different outstate Nebraska legislative districts. Our objective is for voters to hear about issues and policies directly from candidates in a nonpartisan environment. We also have a service through the League of Women Voters that we hope that you will employ in finding out more about the candidates, your polling place, et cetera, to find out what district you are in and what candidates will be on your ballot in November. Please visit vote4one.org. It's organized and published by the League of Women Voters with the work of many volunteers. It's a one-stop shop for election-related information. It provides specifics about the election process, details about general and state candidates, and information directly from candidates about their platform for the candidates who respond to the Vote 411 questionnaire. As our organization is committed to transparency, we want to be clear about our process tonight. We invited all candidates from contested legislative races outside of the Omaha and Lincoln metro areas. Candidates were provided 2 date options and were contacted several times. We engaged all candidates equally. Some did not respond. Some could not attend due to scheduling, and some declined. Due to the number of candidates who did indicate an interest, a session was held earlier this week with another set of candidates for the state legislature. The opponent of one of our candidates here tonight did participate in the earlier event. The candidates here tonight and at the earlier conversation are those who are willing and able to connect with voters through this league hosted event. So we really thank both of you for being here tonight. The format tonight also utilizes methods to ensure equitability and transparency. As facilitator, I will ask a series of questions that each candidate will have equal time to respond to. The order was determined by a drawing that Rachel and I held earlier. And Mr. Lease, you'll be the one going first. Okay. Of the two. The order was determined by that, and like I said, and the first speaker will shift with each question. So we'll go back and forth between the two of you. So each of you will have the first question and the second question. So we are going to jump in with introductions and opening statements by the candidates. Each of you have 1 minute, and we'll start with Mr. Lease from District 48.
Well, thank you for the opportunity to be here and interview with you. I am Don Lease, grew up in the edge of Morrill, Banner County, lifelong resident of the Panhandle of Nebraska. Have a family, my wife Yvonne, she's actually graduated with her master's degree from Kearney State, University of Nebraska, Kearney. She's a little younger. So we have 4 kids, raised them in a variety of different settings from the same ranch location that we still live in. So my 4 kids range in age from 36 to 20. The youngest one's going to Wayne State right now, looking to be a teacher. So been active in the local government in terms of school board, things like that. Currently active, I'm on the Region 1 Advisory Committee for the region up here. I'm on the Homelessness Council for the Panhandle area. We're a Panhandle-wide group. I belong to Potter's Wheel Ministry. I'm on the board of directors there. So it's just a great time to be able to visit with you. And my minute should be about up, so.
Okay, now we'll go to Mr. Lippincott from District 34. Is that correct? No, 34. I was right. District 34.
Lauren Lippincott. I live on a farm halfway between Central City and Fullerton. It's the house where I grew up. Went to a one-room country school, went to public school in Central City, graduated, went to the University of Nebraska in Lincoln, got a degree in broadcast journalism, worked as a disc jockey at a radio station all the way through school. Also worked as an announcer at KOLN TV, Channel 10 in Lincoln. Did that full-time for 1 year after college. While I was going through college, I also worked for Alan Behrman, the Secretary of State, and also 2 years as a page in the legislature, my junior and senior year in college. Worked for KOLN TV for about a year, joined the Air Force, went to pilot training in Enid, Oklahoma, Advanced Air Force Base, stayed on as an instructor pilot for about 3 years. After that, then flew F-16s at Ramstein, Germany, and did that for about 4 years. Finished my time with the Air Force and then got hired by Delta Airlines and flew for Delta a full career, 30 years, retired at age 65 and back to the farm. And that's where I am right now.
Thank you. We will, I guess, begin our first question since Mr. Lippincott just spoke. So Mr. Lease, we're going back to you. And our first question, and we'll answer it, are several senators have stated that they plan to bring legislation to further loosen gun restrictions in Nebraska. What do you think the appropriate level of regulation should be?
I don't know that we need to have a lot of regulation of guns. Basically, guns are not the problem. The people that carry the guns are. Even with all the regulations we currently have, it's very difficult to keep people honest in terms of the paperwork that they have to fill out. They can lie without consequence, basically, on the paperwork until they commit some sort of offense and get caught. Regulation is not the answer. Controlling drugs is probably our biggest problem, and that sounds kind of broad from asking a gun question, but our gun violence is primarily drug related in the United States. I don't see that we have a great need for any more regulation than we have. The Constitution is pretty clear about our right to keep and bear arms, and I certainly support that. I don't see any regulations that would be meaningful to curb violence, as essentially we can't control people's attitudes. We have other weapons that are at our disposal, including knives and cars. So I don't see strengthening any gun regulations at this point in time, nor would I support that.
All right, thank you, Mr. Lease. Mr. Lippincott, again, what do you think the appropriate level of regulation for guns should be?
There are two things regarding the Second Amendment that I would be for. One is constitutional carry. What that means is this. Currently, what we have is open carry. So a person can walk around just like Matt Dillon on Gunsmoke and have a 6-shooter on their hip. And that's okay. Most states have that. However, constitutional carry would say that we can have a concealed carry permit without receiving a permission slip from the government. Currently, right now, to get a concealed carry license, $200 a day of training and all that. Training is fantastic. The government should not mandate it. So that's constitutional carry. I'm also for stand your ground legislation, as opposed to what we have right now, which is the doctrine called the castle doctrine. Your home is your castle. So you can defend yourself using lethal force at your home and place of business, but not otherwise. Stand your ground would make it so you can defend yourself anywhere you are legally.
So going back and forth from two people is a little crazy sometimes, but Mr. Lippincott, you're actually going to get the next question first. So the president recently signed into law the biggest climate change investment in American history, which includes funds to help rural communities develop solutions resilient to the impacts of climate change. On a state level, how should Nebraska address climate change?
That's kind of a tough one. You need to take a couple things into consideration. Number one, some states now, specifically California, is saying that you cannot use fuel produced like what we do here in Nebraska, ethanol, unless the carbon being used in producing that ethanol is being piped and captured. But let's just review very briefly our high school biology. chemistry and science. Our atmosphere consists of 78% nitrogen, 21% oxygen, 1% consisting of 0.9 argon and 0.1 water vapor, carbon, methane, and there's one other thing. Man-produced fossil fuels is 0.0014% of the environment, negligible.
Okay, Mr. Lease, again, the question on a state level, how should Nebraska address climate change?
Well, I don't think it's up to the individual states if we truly have climate change to address that issue. That'd be a national issue. I don't really see a significant role for Nebraska in that. We always want to be as efficient and effective at managing our environment as we can. We use ethanol. Ethanol is a super product as far as I'm concerned. We can combine that with gasoline. We get it net energy generated. The carbon dioxide can be captured, and where it's economical to do that, to be injected in ground oil bearing formations in the ground, or older formations deep in the ground. If we're going to store it, that'd be the way to do it. I'm not against alternate energy sources like solar or wind energy, but to give the tax breaks, to stimulate the tax breaks, seems somewhat pointless. If we really need to do this, we should be able to figure out ways through enterprises to do it without the government having to finance it. I don't necessarily think that we have as serious a problem with global warming as we have. Having said that, we're instead of snow in the background, I could have the smoke from the most recent fire. That is a climatological phenomenon that happens periodically throughout history. You have to remember, we only have about 140 to 150 years of recorded weather data. If we listen to the people, the earth is much older than that. So we really don't have a good understanding of whether in fact humans are even creating climate change, and if they are, how we should address that. I'm still, again, I'll emphasize, I'm not against using alternate sources to generate electricity. I'm not against electric cars per se, but they have to be economically efficient in order for us to adopt those technologies.
Okay, you have the next question, Mr. Lease.
Okay.
Going first. What do you think is the most productive way to retain and recruit working people to Nebraska?
We should work on some of the tax solutions to retain and entice people to come to Nebraska. We have one of the highest property taxes in the United States. I think we're fifth behind the highest in Nebraska. And if we think in terms of development of housing and things like that, in Scottsbluff, Nebraska, if you own a $300,000 house, just the education portion of your tax bill is going to be $3,000 a year. That's pretty significant divided out by 12. We're going to have a $250 a month payment just to support the school tax. So one of the things we need to do to recruit people to Nebraska is lower our tax structure, especially in the property tax, where you pay it whether you make money or not, whether you have a job or not, whether your farming operation makes money or not, you're going to pay property tax. I'm not against paying for our local infrastructure, but if the state of Nebraska deems it's necessary that we educate every child in the state, it maybe should be the state's job to see that that's done with state taxes. We have a great society in Nebraska. Scottsbluff's a great place to live. I've been all across Nebraska. There are a lot of great places. We just need to get people convinced that we're slower, simpler, but we have all the available technologies and things that we need for them to be able to work in Nebraska. We certainly need to work on our internet infrastructure, our our structure's a little lacking in some of the rural parts. If I were not in Scottsbluff, we'd have a difficult time carrying on this Zoom call. So
Okay, well,
we
thank you.
need to continue.
All right, let's move on to Mr. Lippincott. Again, the same question. What do you think the most productive way to retain and recruit working people to Nebraska?
Just last week, I met with a gentleman in Grand Island. His name is Ray O'Connor, and Ray builds a lot of houses, apartment complexes, and he owns business buildings. He made this very interesting observation. He said when he came back from the Army and settled in Grand Island in 1971, which the population was about 25,000 people in Grand Island at the time, there were 950 homes for sale, almost 1,000. Today, there's 78 houses for sale, and the city of Grand Island has doubled. I met with another individual, Cliff Messner in Central City. They build homes. He says, we are 3 years behind on building homes. There is a severe lack of housing in the state of Nebraska. And as the other gentleman said, taxes also dissuades people from coming to Nebraska. The property taxes, too high.
Mr. Lippincott, you are first on this question. What do you think is the most pressing issue in K through 12 education, and what would you do to tackle it?
I like to ask people that question all the time when I get interviewed by these different lobbying groups and such. I've knocked on over 5,000 doors, and I would say by a factor of 40 to 1, the most pressing issue on the minds of people is what's going on in school with their kids from K through 12 and also in colleges. And what I mean by that specifically is age inappropriate sex education makes them fighting mad. I mean, they're very, very angry about that. Also, the CRT, critical race theory, 1619 project, Black Lives Matter, all of these things they're getting sidetracked on instead of teaching the 3 R's, reading, writing, and arithmetic. And the same thing is true in colleges. So people are very, very concerned with what's being taught in school, what is being taught versus what's not being taught.
All right, thank you. The same question to you, Mr. Lease. What is the most pressing issue in K through 12 education, and what would you do to tackle it?
I think the most serious issue we have is mental health care. Education and mental health go hand in hand. They're completely intertwined and inseparable. If a kid has mental health issues, whether they're 5 years old or 15 years old, they're going to have a difficult time learning. We need to address back into the families some of the mental health issues that we see. A lot of those are intertwined also with substance abuse issues, people with substance abuse disorders. And we need to reach out to some of these families. They may only comprise 10, 15, 20% of our problem students in the school, or students in the school, but they're about 90% of our problem students in the school. We need to give those kids a fighting chance. And the only way we're going to do that is to try and help them overcome their trauma issues through mental health care and education back into the family. It has to start with the family. It has to be something the family's required to do when we have these students that are socially and educationally unfit for education. I also agree with Mr. Lippincott that we need to focus on what's important, and that's reading, writing, and arithmetic. To be teaching kindergartners how they need to deal or identify sexes is just outrageous on my part. I went through this back in the 90s, and it started in the same place with the State Board of Education. It resulted in the same thing. The State Board of Education became very conservative. The folks that promoted that left, and I believe that's going to happen at this point in time throughout the year. I'm hoping it will. But we have to stand against the unreasonable interjection of a small part of society on our public schools.
Okay, let's move on to the next question. Mr. Lease, you are the first person to answer this. What is the best way to address our current criminal justice system pressures, including prison overcrowding, sentencing reform, and restoring voting rights to former felons?
The best way to address it is mental health care. Most of the people who end up in prisons start out as first graders that are socially maladjusted. They have trauma issues within their family, and that is not their fault. Somebody caused those traumas on those people. One of the things we need, if we ramp up mental health care, it's going to pay off. The problem is this 10 or 15 or 20 years down the road. $1 spent on mental health care for a young child equals $7 in saved expenses from incarceration in the teenage or 20s. And we're looking at $70,000 a year to keep somebody in prison. We need to work hard to rehabilitate those folks in prison. And it can't be something that the inmate is taking lightly. They have to be some way encouraged to comply with their treatment. And we need to offer that treatment in an effective and efficient way. Not treating prisoners is not a good plan.
Okay, thank you. Let's move to Mr. Lippincott. Again, the question is, what is the best way to address our current criminal justice system pressures, which would include prison overcrowding, sentencing reform, and restoring voting rights to former felons?
Well, first off, I think that if you're guilty of a felony, I think you should lose your voting rights. But I saw a very interesting statistic recently, and it talked about people who get out of prison, and it showed this very interesting statistic. 77% of people that serve time in prison end up back in prison. 77%, that's a lot. However, when they were in prison, if they voluntarily were involved in a faith-based ministry in prison, there was only an 8% chance that they would end up back in prison. We have seen God kicked out of our schools, out of the government, out of society, and out of a lot of churches, actually. And so we're seeing the result of what we've sown. And we need to get God back in the center of society. And I would agree with him in terms of we also need to show kids, help them connect the dots between cause and effect. For instance, show them, maybe have a mock arrest of a student, a time in jail. It would kind of like be driver's ed, but in this case, it would be for drug abuse and spending time in jail. My time's up.
Thank you. This is your first shot at this question, Mr. Lippincott. Will you work to preserve the nonpartisan nature of our unicameral? And if so, how would you do that?
Well, that's what it is right now. I think that it does work. The problem that we have is that Lincoln and Omaha seem to get more, and because their population increases, obviously, they're getting more and more voice in the legislature. And that is a concern. As most of your viewers know, each legislative district has 40,000 people in it. And so my district has all of Hamilton, part of Hall County, Merritt County, Nance County, 40,000 people. But again, Lincoln and Omaha, because the towns are growing, the legislative representation from those towns increases. Those towns have a tendency to be a little bit more liberal, and that's a concern, a legitimate concern with the rural western part of the state of Nebraska. But I do believe that right now, the status quo, what we have, is a good one.
Thank you. So, Mr. Lease, for you, will you work to preserve the nonpartisan nature of our unicameral? And if so, how?
I think the nonpartisan nature of the legislature is a good thing. You know, a lot of people are talking about we should go back to a two house system, Senate and the House of Representatives. That might short term help our problems, but I don't see that as a long term solution. As far as nonpartisan, you know, I'm a consensus builder, but sometimes you just can't build consensus with people. As Mr. Lippincott said, we're definitely outvoted in the western part of the state, and that presents a problem. Funding a lot of times is also shorted out here because there's more people in the western or eastern part of the state. We need to create a formula with most of our aid type stuff that acknowledges the fact of sparsity in western Nebraska. In the 12 counties up. All right, thank you.
Well, you have the next question, Mr. Lease. Abortion and reproductive rights will surely be a topic in the next legislative session. Do you favor legislation? And if so, what would you support in a bill?
I'm not a believer in abortion. I don't know that there should be any type of legal abortion other than to protect the life of the mother. It's difficult for me to sit here and say that in cases of rape and incest, but I think there's always a better solution, even in those cases. Killing a baby is not something I support at all. I'm done.
Okay, thank you. Mr. Lippincott, the same question. And again, abortion and reproductive rights will surely be a topic in the next legislative session. Do you favor legislation? And if so, what would you support in the bill?
It's very interesting that it's always framed abortion rights. In our Constitution, rights come from God and are protected by the government. I believe that life begins when two cells become one. So life begins at conception all the way to natural death. People like to throw up the rape and incest issues. Jesse Jackson would probably be interested in voicing his concern on that because Jesse Jackson was the result of a rape. Abortions due to rape is less than half of 1%, and due to incest is 1/100th of 1%. So again, two wrongs don't make a right. I'm pro-life from conception all the way to natural death.
A bunch of geese fly by my house on the lake. Anyway, so Mr. Lippincott, you have the first answer to this question. There were several bills brought last legislative session about elections, voting access, and things of that nature. What do you think is the primary issue that needs to be focused on when we are talking about elections and voters?
Well, a number of things, but I'll just address voter ID. That's very black and white. Right now, 35 states have voter ID. Canada has voter ID, we don't. Mexico has voter ID, we don't. In Mexico, they were experiencing voter fraud, so they thought, let's go ahead and incorporate voter ID, which includes the government ID plus a thumbprint. Their voter turnout went from 59% to 68%. It increased by 9 percentage points because people believed in the integrity of voting. In Europe, right now, 37 countries out of 38 countries have voter ID, and soon it will be 38 out of 38 because there's legislation pending before the parliament in Great Britain. Voter ID helps with the integrity of voting, and we need that here in Nebraska.
Now to you, Mr. Lease. Again, what do you think is the primary, what do you think the primary issue that needs to be focused on when we are talking about elections and voters?
It definitely is restoring the confidence of the American public and the people of the state of Nebraska in the election process. I think a big part of that is voter ID. There's no case I can think of where it's going to interfere with somebody's right to vote because they don't identify themselves with a standard issue government ID, whether it's a driver's license or just a state ID card. Those are readily available. Almost all of us have driver's license. Those that don't are certainly capable and should be furnished at no cost if need be. A state ID card, which would be used for voting. Other than that, there's a few little things within our voting system that probably need to be addressed. But by and large, I think we have a sound voting system here in Nebraska that's not at least prone to fraud.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Lease, you get the first answer to this question, which is always our favorite question. And it's our last question. What is the favorite thing about your district?
I think my favorite thing about the 48th district is the people. I've worked throughout the Panhandle with the Nebraska Strong Recovery Project from August of 20 to December of 21. We have a lot of fine people. We're spread out all over everywhere. There's a few concentrated population centers, but by and large, people care about each other. They care about Nebraska. They don't want big changes. They don't want more government. And I agree with those things. I just think we have a great group of people, not only in the Panhandle, but throughout Nebraska. One of my favorite things is demographics is demographics. And that's part of how I think I can work in the legislature to create consensus about changes that need to occur in Nebraska. Thank you.
All right, thank you. And Mr. Lippincott, again, what is your favorite thing about District 34?
Last week, the Nebraska State Fair was being held in Grand Island, and there were a lot of people from the 34th Legislative District there. And I made a comment to one of the people that were working. There were two young girls, probably junior high age, maybe high school. And we've got this great big bowl of candy. And the girls came by and they very politely says, "May we have a piece of candy, please?" Sure, got it. And then they just stood back and they said, "Thank you." And I thought to myself, I love living here in Nebraska. Nebraska nice. I flew for the airlines for 30 years, flew all over the world, 5 continents, 53 different countries, and all over the place. And every time you flew to the Midwest, Nebraska, Kansas, the people were not, even the flight attendants would comment about it. "Oh, the people are back. They're so nice." And they are. Nebraska nice is not just a term or motto. It's the real thing. People back here are friendly.
Thank you. All right. Well, thanks to Mr. Lease and also Mr. Lippincott for taking part in tonight's conversation. Again, thank you for joining us. If you want to learn more about the candidates and the issues that will be on your ballot, again, what we have recommended is please visit vote411.org for a personalized resource tool. It's a really cool platform. You just enter your address. You can check on your polling place, which is really important this year because some polling places have changed with redistricting. A special thank you, especially to the candidates for participating in tonight's conversation. Again, we really appreciate it. For the League of Women Voters, I'm Diane Bystrom. As always, we urge you to be informed and to be a voter on November 8th. Thank you.